Sharma. I gather we've got a slight technical hitch, but we seem to be ready to go.
We are. My lady, the first witness is Professor John Manners-Bell.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Professor Manners-Bell, you have provided the inquiry with an expert report. The reference is 474864. It extends to approximately 200 pages. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to confirm that that report is true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
Absolutely.
Professor Manners-Bell, you are the Chief Executive of a global market research organisation, Transport Intelligence Limited, the founder of the Foundation of Future Supply Chain, a Fellow of the UK Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. You are formerly the Honorary Visiting Professor at London Metropolitan University, Guildhall Faculty of Business and Law. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You are also the former Chair of the Supply Chain and Logistics Global Advisory Council of the World Economic Forum.
Yep.
You are the author of several published works, including texts on global logistics and supply chain risk management.
That is correct.
I wonder, Professor Manners-Bell, if we could start, please, with an introduction to supply chains, what they are, why they matter, and what they comprise of.
Certainly, and I think that the first thing to recognise with supply chains is that in usual times, they work away in the background. Nobody really understands or recognises that they're there. And the first time that people will understand that supply chains actually exist is when they break, and when you can't get the food on the shelves, or you can't get the right medicines at your hospital, or indeed, as we're all here today, is because you can't get hold of the right PPE. And so I would say up until 2011 or so, there is really very little understanding of what could go wrong in supply chains. But as a whole, supply chains relate to the movement of goods from suppliers who, in many cases, are offshored, outsourced to China, to Asia. Those products move through the supply chain through a variety of different companies assembling those goods. They're shipped usually internationally by sea freight or by air cargo. They then arrive in the Western market, where they go through, again, a whole process of different organizations such as wholesalers, distributors, retailers, before they arrive at the consumer. And at every stage, value is being added by all the different companies which are involved in that supply chain. And as you have one flow of goods from Asia, usually, I mean, not always, but in many cases it is, from Asia to the West, you also have flows of information, of data, which go up and down the supply chain, which provide levels of visibility, tracking where are your goods, what part of the process, the order process, are they.
Thank you, Professor. Can I ask you just to pause there? Perhaps during the course of your evidence, I'm going to take you through a number of charts which you very helpfully provided in your report. The first one is at page 15 of your report, and it touches on just what you've been explaining to the inquiry. There it is on screen. What you've just described to the inquiry is that moving in one direction is the flow of goods from the supplier to the manufacturer, to the distributor, the retailer, and ultimately to the customer. The flow of funds in the opposite direction. And then could you help us, please, with the arrow pointing in two directions, which refers to the flow of information, and you've referred to visibility. Could you help us, please, with what they mean in the context of supply chains?
Certainly, and this is absolutely critical issue related to supply chain and the efficiency and the effectiveness of how the supply chain works. If you're a customer, just to work through an example, and you place an order via, maybe it could be on an online retailer, platform or whatever, then that triggers the release of an order process throughout the whole supply chain, and whoever the retailer may be, whoever's fulfilling that, will order to its suppliers to replenish the stock, which is moved on to the customer. Those suppliers will then place orders further up the supply chain, internationally, usually, as I was saying, in terms of manufacturing, especially with consumer goods, and until it triggers a whole range of different events throughout that supply chain. And so that's what I mean by the data flowing back up the supply chain. But once that order has been placed by the supplier, then that they will upload some data to their platform that they are using, which will inform every other member of the supply chain all the way back to the consumer when that goods will be delivered, when that order will be fulfilled. And so that is the flow up and down.
Now, this figure, of course, is a simplification of something which is far more complicated happening underneath. Could we have, please, figure 2, which is at page 16 of your report?
Yes, and as the inquiry can see, things are much more complicated than the first diagram which we displayed. There are multiple tiers of suppliers, and many of those tiers will work for other companies within the supply chain as well. And this is getting closer to the reality of a PPE supply chain, which we'll come on to a lot later.
And so just looking at figure 2, on the left-hand side, there are number 2 tier suppliers. What are they, please?
They are suppliers who are working for other companies within the supply chain. So a tier 1 supplier would have contact and link with the main customer who is organizing the manufacturer of a particular product. Tier 2 suppliers will work for those tier 1 suppliers, and in many cases you can go down to tier 5, tier 6 suppliers. So many tiers of suppliers all working for each other, all undertaking different processes within the supply chain. They are being subcontracted to manufacture components, intermediate goods, which then are assembled at a later stage within that supply chain. So it is highly complicated.
So there are a high number of different relationships at different layers involved ultimately in making sure that goods pass from one side of this diagram ultimately to the other, the right, to the consumers.
Exactly, that's right.
And in the course of this, the movement of goods from one side to the other, you refer in your report to there being a combination of collaboration and competition between different entities in a supply chain. Could you help us with that, please?
Yes, certainly. In many cases, many of these suppliers who are manufacturers in their own right will also be competing for the same business as for the main customer. So many times they will also supply goods to other suppliers, other manufacturers within the industry, but at the same time as that, they may also be supplying direct to the end manufacturer, the original equipment manufacturer.
What are the problems, just in general terms, which are created by that combination of complexity and the lack of visibility within the supply chains? What happens?
Well, absolutely. It is the lack of visibility which is the problem, because data will be existing at various different silos, they're called, within the supply chain. So each supplier has its own resource of data, which, because it may be competing with other companies, with other suppliers, with other manufacturers within the supply chain, it may not want to share for competitive reasons, commercial reasons. So consequently, getting visibility throughout the whole supply chain is very, very difficult, especially when we're talking about multiple tiers of suppliers.
And is that because each of these entities within a supply chain is trying to protect the data which it holds about the products which it's buying and selling and about what it knows about the market?
That is correct, yes.
I'd like to turn, please, to some of the features of the healthcare supply chains that this module is concerned with, and some of the unique characteristics there are with PPE, with ventilators, and with testing equipment. I wonder if we could start, please, with PPE supply chains. What is it about PPE which marks it as perhaps unique and different to other consumer goods which may be purchased in supermarkets and elsewhere?
Well, exactly. At some level, they do look very similar to many consumer goods because they are a low cost, they're manufactured remotely, offshored, and in that respect, it does resemble a consumer goods manufacturing supply chain. But of course, as we saw throughout the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, one of the key areas of differentiation is the criticality of those goods to public health, to healthcare workers. And so if in a consumer goods supply chain, you're not able to get hold of whatever it may be that you want to buy, it's not the end of the world. If you're not able to get a face mask, or if you're not able to get any other element, item of PPE, then it becomes absolutely critical, which means that the supply chains need to be highly robust, highly resilient in order to ensure the supply.
For each of those categories of healthcare equipment, they have slightly different characteristics. So for PPE, you've touched upon the fact that they are low volume and low cost. Is that fair?
Yeah, low value and high volume.
Thank you. And what about with respect to ventilators? By contrast to items of PPE, we've heard evidence from witnesses last week that described the manufacture of PPE as being something which is actually quite technical and specific. But for ventilators, it's another level of complexity, isn't it?
Absolutely. They resemble high-tech goods, and their supply chains resemble high-tech supply chains, very, very different from consumer goods and PPE.
And what about with respect to testing equipment?
For testing equipment, again, we see there are differences. For example, in one item of PPE, you may have 5 different components coming together. In some elements, some types of testing equipment, it may be 60 different parts which are being brought together within a kit. It's different types of materials. Some of those materials used are also hazardous, and so it's far more complicated in terms of the manufacturer. And in terms of the use of testing equipment, when the tests are being sent back to be analysed, there's a whole new loop as well in terms of the life of that testing equipment, which you don't get with PPE. PPE, you're used, it's usually a single use, and then it's disposed of. And maybe we'll come back to that later on.
So there are a number of different ways in which the categories of healthcare equipment that this module is considering, they vary and their supply chains are different owing to the characteristics of the items which are being bought and sold.
Absolutely right.
Just to touch on what you described as a closed loop that you refer to with respect to testing equipment.
That's right.
And is that because the tests, or some kinds of tests, have to go to the consumer and then they have to be returned?
Yes, that is correct. And then because some of the testing equipment is manufactured specifically to the testing companies, they have to be sent back to a specific location, which adds an air of complexity within the supply chain.
I'd like to move, please, on to how one measures the success of supply chains. You refer in your report to what is called the 6 R's, and they are the right products, in the right place, at the right time, in the right condition, of the right quality, and at the right price. And are those the means by which one can measure the success or failure of a supply chain?
Yes, I believe so. It's a well-used rubric within the industry, within the commercial industry, of how to measure the effectiveness of a supply chain, and it applies equally well to the PPE sector as well and other healthcares.
And in terms of the supply chains which this inquiry in this module is considering, namely PPE, ventilators and testing equipment, is there any doubt in your mind about the success or failure of the supply chains for that equipment?
Yes, and I've written down a quote from the Welsh government, and it applies equally to all the devolved administrations and the UK government. But they said that delivering PPE stock to local health boards did not necessarily mean it reached the right hospital or the right ward. And that is an example. It really provides an illustration to the 6 Ps to 6 rights we were talking about, because in supply chain terms, not getting the PPE to the right place means a critical supply chain failure. You may not have bothered to have those goods in the first place if you're not able to get them to where they're needed at the right time to the right people.
Could we have up, please, another chart that you've produced in your report on page 33, figure 7. This is volatility in demand and supply variables during COVID, and you've described it as creating a dysfunctional market. And on the left-hand side are what are described as demand variables. So those variables coming from the demand side of the equation. And under there, it says the unknown infection and patient hospitalization rates affects the underlying demand for PPE. Another factor was the changing government guidance on the frequency of use of PPE in medical settings, changing government guidance on extension of use of PPE by the general public and businesses, multiple health procurement organisations in competition and making multiple orders, and then finally the bullwhip effect. What is the effect of the combination of the demand variables on this side of the equation?
Well, in simple terms, it leads to huge volatility in demand. Supply chains work best in a more stable environment. And once you have multiple demand variables, all of which are highly volatile, then it goes back to what I was referring to in the first slide, when that data is transmitted up the supply chain. But the uncertainty, the instability which is being transmitted up the supply chain then causes a whole range of signals in terms of production, the requirement, the demand that's required for PPE goods, which then leads to, as we say, a market dysfunction.
There are, of course, at least on the left-hand side, some areas in which the government does have control in terms of its policy. One or two of them are the guidance on the frequency of use of PPE and the rate at which that changes. Could you help us, please? What particular effect does changing guidance or changing guidance regularly have on supply chains?
Yes, I think probably the biggest impact would be on the the usage of PPE, whether it should be single use or sessional use, how many items of PPE are required throughout a single day, for example, referring to the patient involved, whether the level of hospitalization, for example. So that is very clearly one of the biggest impacts on demand. But I think there are many of the other issues which are also highlighted also had similar effects.
And in terms of the multiple health procurement organisations, are you referring to the fact that each devolved administration in the UK had its own procurement system and its own body which was buying items such as PPE?
Yes, I mean it's a very fragmented demand side from from NHS supply chain to the various health trusts that we have in England. Obviously, in the devolved administrations, there is a centralisation of procurement across the 4 nations. But then, when you look further at in terms of the primary health and the social care, these organisations were also buying their own PPE. But beyond that, you could also add other government departments, such as the MOD, for example. They were all buying PPE. They were all holding stocks of PPE as well. But just to put this in the global context as well, it's not just the UK, obviously. Every country around the world had similar problems, and this was all feeding back to the suppliers, largely based in China, to create this dysfunction.
And turning to the other side of this equation, the supply variables, you describe on this side of the equation material bottlenecks and production capacity, an inability to meet regulatory standards, government intervention in trade processes, disruption to air transport and shipping industry, and that point which you referred to before, the lack of supply chain visibility. Taking all of these together, what effect did this have on supply chains which were providing PPE to the UK and worldwide?
Well, it had a devastating effect on them. In the first, putting it in context, in the first 2 months of 2020, actually more PPE was being shipped to China than was being shipped out of China. And that's because of the progress of the pandemic around the world. The pandemic, of course, hit China, and it also impacted very much on the suppliers, the manufacturers in China as well. And so consequently, when the pandemic had spread to other regions, first to Italy and Europe, and then the rest of Europe, there were these systemic problems in terms of supply. And then in terms of the international transportation element, if you look at the air cargo industry, for example, the air passenger sector was impacted by a lack of services flying to China, and so consequently there were bottlenecks in terms of being able to get available capacity when it came back on stream to Europe. So there was a whole host, a concatenation, you might say, of supplied variables which came together to cause this huge stress.
Could we touch, please, briefly on one of the points which is referred to on the demand variable side with another chart, which is at page 22 of your report, figure 5, the bullwhip effect.
Yes.
Thank you. Could we zoom in? This is figure 5, the bullwhip effect. On the bottom, it's referred to customer demand referring up to the supplier. And on the left-hand side, it says a small change in customer demand seems to create an exponential effect up the supply chain. Could you please talk us through what's happening here and how this affects supply chains in an emergency?
Yes, and this is partly industry practice, partly psychological behavior of people involved in the procurement process. But when there is even a small change in customer demand, the supplier will then obviously fulfill that demand, but that when they replenish, they will pass on their orders further up the supply chain. And at each stage within that, their supplier will add more and more to each order, because the worst thing that could possibly happen in terms of supply chain is being out of stock. So consequently, the whole behavior of every company within that supply chain is to overorder to make sure that they don't run out of stock. They think there's nothing wrong with that at their stage of the supply chain, but of course if that's passed on right the way down through many of those tiers that we saw in some of those earlier graphics, then we see there is a huge demand which is actually not illustrative of the real demand actually in the market at the time, but it is passed on down the supply chain.
Thank you. Can I take you, please, moving perhaps away from some of the theory about the way in which supply chains operate and dealing with what the practical consequences are of the matters that you've referred to in your evidence, so market dysfunction, the bullwhip effect, and so on. What effect does that have on those who are on the front line trying to procure items such as PPE?
Well, it creates a hugely difficult market for them. A lot of the, as I think much of the evidence you've heard last week will suggest, the supply chains in the UK were very much set up for business as usual. I think you've heard that term a lot over the last week, rather than actually to deal with these major peaks of demand. As I mentioned earlier on, supply chains work very well in times of stability, but they need the flexibility and agility to work in the times of emergency, crisis, as we see. So what we found was that the supply chain and the logistics in the UK just wasn't able to cope with the demands which were being placed upon it. The systems were not set up, whether they were the warehousing systems or whether they were the procurement systems. The framework system which had been set up by the NHS supply chain wasn't able to cope with the demand either, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later on as well.
Could I just interrupt for a second? During module 1, I think it was 1, maybe 2, I thought I was told by a number of, certainly politicians, that as a result of preparations for Brexit, a lot of work had been done on supply chains that was of use. Would you agree with that assertion?
Yes, I do. I certainly agree with that. And there was a lot of work was also being put into in terms of the preparedness for pandemics and influenza, in terms of the PIP stocks, which I'm sure we'll come on to as well. And some of that work went back to 2003 when we saw the first pandemic, and there have been iterations over the last 20 years. So there were certainly preparations put in place, but they weren't anywhere near to being sufficiently robust enough to deal with the demand of the pandemic.
So some work, but not enough.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Professor Manners-Bell, one of the reviews which you conducted during the course of your report was into the exercises which my lady considered in Module 1 in relation to preparedness for pandemics. What did you discover about procurement and supply chains in the exercises which you reviewed?
Well, I think there are two, we go back to my lady's point, yes, work had been done in terms of the preparation, but I think there were two key areas where there was work, it was lacking. And the fundamental problem of the exercises, as far as I can see, and from what I've read, was that a global shortage of pandemic was not taken into account. So in supply chain terms, the downstream element was dealt with, moving PPE from warehouses through the supply chain to the healthcare workers who needed it. So work was done on that part, but nobody, as far as I am aware, actually looked at the possibility that there would be a global constraint of PPE.
And one of the recommendations which you make, and we don't need to turn to it, is that such exercises in the future do take into account such factors as strains in the supply chain and difficulties with procurement. Is that right?
That is absolutely right, yes.
Turning, please, to the global trends in supply chains leading up to the pandemic and how it was that supply chains had the structures and features that they had in 2020. Is it right that since the 1980s, there's just been generally a move towards offshore manufacturing to lower cost markets for items such as PPE?
Yes, indeed. There's, I think almost every sector will have been impacted by this offshoring and outsourcing trend, largely driven through the low-cost manufacturing resources which exist throughout Asia. That has been underpinned by improvements in data flows, which gives more visibility of what's happening throughout Asia as well. And also very importantly, that since the 1950s and the containerization of shipping, it's been very cheap to move goods around the world.
So in those countries, the labour is obviously of lower cost. There's greater production scalability, I think you describe it as. It means that there's less inventory holding in the countries in which the stock is required. And as a consequence, the supply chains that supply the UK and other countries for critical items such as PPE, they are more vulnerable, aren't they?
They are. They are from a whole range of different risks. I think I mentioned 2011 was probably when risk really came onto the agenda, and the reason for that was that there were some very important natural disasters around that time. There was a tsunami in Japan. There was floods in Thailand, and people suddenly, in the commercial sector, started to understand that an event happening on the other side of the world could still lead to automotive production being halted, for example, in Sunderland, or in the high-tech sector, that it would have huge ramifications in parts of the Western world in terms of high-tech manufacturing, for example.
And have those trends continued since the pandemic, or has there been some change in the trends?
Yes, now it's what I call a hybrid approach is being adopted. So if we take a step back further before the offshoring and outsourcing trend, it was very much a case that there would be high levels of inventory would be held just in case there was a major problem. Much of that inventory was held within Europe or in the UK, close to the end markets. When you have offshoring and outsourcing, that's the risk elements of holding inventory goes down, and along with that, the financial costs of holding inventory goes down, but all these other risks increase, whether those are political, economics, societal, technological, or environmental, as I was saying.
Touching, please, on what you've just mentioned, stockpiles and inventory, and the practicality of stockpiles and inventory within the UK. Could you help us with this, please? Prior to the pandemic, was there a single UK-wide complete inventory of items such as PPE?
Nowhere near. No, I mean a huge fragmentation of data relating to inventory.
And is it right that that was aggravated not only by the fact that inventory was held by the UK government, it was also held by devolved administrations, it was held by trusts and boards and other health organisations. And so there's an enormous amount of data about what inventory holdings there are, but nobody knows, or rather nobody knew prior to the pandemic what there was.
That's right, and many of the organisations you've just mentioned had different stages in their technological development as well. So some may be using, I think, what one witness called a sort of analog, so paper and pen. Others would be using spreadsheets as well. And there was no sort of interrelation or integration or the ability to integrate those different data silos as well. But just to add to that, in terms of the complexity, of course, that's all in the downstream inventory. If you take into account the many distributors and manufacturers involved as well, there was no single view of the truth, as it's called, single view of inventory throughout the whole of the supply chain, which is just as critical in my mind.
The inquiry will be hearing evidence from Mr. Webster and Ms. Lawson. We don't need to turn the statements up, but what they say in their witness statements was that there was no way of tracking what the individual trusts had, and there was no way of tracking what the individual products were that were being bought by institutions such as SCCL.
That is absolutely right, yes.
Could we have up, please, one of your recommendations? It's at page 79 and 80 of your report. You've made a number of recommendations, I think 29 in total. We'll just touch on some of them during the course of your evidence. It begins at the bottom of page 79. And what you have suggested is that there be maintained a digital twin of a complete UK inventory of PPE and healthcare equipment through an inventory management system. You've described it as an aspirational post-pandemic goal, and you go on to provide details of that. What effect do you think having such an inventory system, a central inventory system, would have on procurement and the supply chains going into a pandemic if it were to happen in the future?
Well, it would definitely forearm the people in charge of the supply chain, whether that's within the NHS supply chain or within the Department of Health and Social Care or even the politicians, to give an accurate view of what inventory is being held, what types of PPE are being held, the volumes that are being held, and where they are being held as well, which is absolutely crucial in any supply chain, not just PPE, to know how much you already have of a particular item.
Could I turn, please, to market concentration? The inquiry will be hearing for witnesses later this morning and this afternoon about China being the dominant market in PPE. And just some figures, if I may. You've described in your report that in the year before the COVID-19 pandemic, it was estimated by the International Finance Corporation, IFC, that China accounted for 50 to 60% of the world's supply of masks, 40% of coveralls, 40% of aprons, 40 to 45% of eye protection, and 30 to 40% of shoe covers. And then you refer to the United States taking up about 20 to 25% of the remaining market share. And then within those figures, there's a little nuance, because gloves, for example, are manufactured predominantly in Malaysia and Thailand. They make up collectively about 85% of the market. What are the risks that come from markets and suppliers and manufacturers being concentrated in a particular part of the world?
There's a whole range of risks. I mean, if we look at the political risks, for example, those can manifest themselves in terms of trade measures. Certainly at the outset of the pandemic, China restricted the supply of PPE because it was really focused on its own domestic issues. That is the case for all countries, not just highlighting China, because actually Germany and France also restricted the exports of PPE.
So that is a phenomenon which means that no matter where you are going to source your PPE and other medical equipment from, that you have to take account of when you're building supply chain resilience.
If you don't manufacture in the UK, there is always a very significant political risk to supply in a pandemic.
What is the solution, to put it bluntly, to concentration of market supply in one particular region, country or area in the world? You've referred on the one hand to diversification in your report. Are there other areas which would limit or mitigate the risk to supply chains in a pandemic?
Yes, well, starting with diversification, I think that is absolutely critical. And again, this is something which is a trend which is being undertaken throughout, not just PPE, but throughout the whole of industry now, especially with the advent of more tariffs and the potential US-China trade war. So looking at multiple countries outside of China is a first step. But, of course, if we have a pandemic which actually develops and evolves from Asia, then the likelihood is all those countries may implement trade measures. And so, consequently, what I suggest and recommend is that we need to look at other markets, including nearshoring, near sourcing from other parts of the world, which may not be impacted at the same time. And as the pandemic evolves throughout the world, then it would, if you had a very proactive supply chain manager in charge of PPE, they would be able to switch on manufacturers located in various parts of the world, which would mitigate this particular risk.
And turning to that recommendation, could we have that please on the screen? Recommendation 22 of your report, which is at page 138. This is a recommendation that combines a number of features, some of which you've touched on and others that we will come on to. You've referred to the UK and devolved administration governments adopting an approach to stockpiles which combines elements of three potential options. Firstly, strategic supplies, which we'll come back to. Secondly, longer-term relationships with Chinese and, critically, your emphasis, non-Chinese suppliers must be maintained or developed, taking into account the possibility that these channels may be rendered ineffectual in a pandemic. And then the third point which you raised, which we'll again come on to, is some contingency for national production to be put into place. So rather than happening upon one solution, if I may, to the supply chain problem, your recommendation is a combination of three or three and a half elements. Could you take us through why exactly that is?
Yes, well, it is absolutely my recommendation that we require a multifaceted approach to building resilience in PPE's supply chain. Absolutely. It's because if we look at a timeline of the development of the pandemic, I see, and some of this is actually relates to some of the preparedness plans which have been put in place already, which we need to have inventory stocks in hand to deal with the pressing need, urgency at the beginning of a pandemic. Now, in the original plans, it was hoped that JIT contracts would then kick in to replenish those stocks.
Forgive me, they're just-in-time contracts?
Just-in-time contracts, yes, would kick in to be able to replenish those stocks. That didn't happen, and the reasons behind that need to be addressed. And my approach, I suppose, really tries to provide a solution for why the JIT manufacturing didn't work in this sort of situation. And there are reasons for that, much because we relied on distributors rather than manufacturers. But if we are able to source goods from other parts of the world, and have deeper engagement with those suppliers as well, that will be critical to this approach.
So does that mean building up longer-term relationships with potential suppliers and manufacturers not only in China, but globally?
Absolutely, yes. You need core, in my mind, in my opinion, what needs to happen is that core relationships with these manufacturers are developed, long-term relationships, which means that when there's stress in the system, you're not suddenly scrabbling around for many hundreds or many thousands of smaller suppliers that you have no relationship with in. You've got no understanding of the quality that they or the quantity they might be able to provide, but you have these very long-term, very deep strategic relationships with core suppliers which are already in place.
But forgive me, what would be the difference between what you are suggesting and what the UK government, for example, had in place when it came to just-in-time contracts? Surely, if those suppliers are based overseas, there's a possibility that those contracts, strategic though they might be, would fail equally. What is it that you suggest would stop that from happening?
Well, I think in some cases the JIT was relying on distributors rather than manufacturers. First point. My second point is that if you have those long-term relationships in place, there is a less likely, there is a smaller likelihood that when there is stress, that those manufacturers will be driven by short-term benefits from the price of PPE. But I completely agree that the only way you could absolutely ensure that you had supplies of PPE would be to develop an onshore manufacturing sector within the UK.
We'll turn to that in a moment. In your report, Professor Manners-Bell, you are quite blunt and you refer to a number of minimum requirements that the UK government has to achieve in order to build supply chain resilience in the long term. The first we've touched upon, which is establishing a control tower to look at the inventory. The second is that you've referred to initiating what you describe as virtual rotating stockpiles to address problems of PPE stock control. Could you help us, please, with that second point, virtual rotating stockpiles? What does that mean?
That's a technique which is used quite widely within industry in order to ensure that stocks do not run out of date. I think one of the witnesses, Mr. Marin from last week, also referred to the rotating stockpile which was being implemented for gloves. But in my mind, there is no reason why it should be limited to one particular type of PPE. By rotating, what we mean is that instead of holding a separate inventory, a separate stock of goods for a particular event, such as the pandemic, those goods are flow into the normal supply chain as business as usual and are always being used. So the likelihood of them going out of date is very much smaller. Now, a virtual rotating stockpile is when that is undertaken by manufacturers throughout the rest of the supply chain, so not held in a specific government-controlled warehouse, for example, but actually the responsibility is with the manufacturers, and they will hold more stock in a relationship with the procurement, with the government procurement on the government's behalf.
I'd like to turn, please, to another element of what you suggest would assist in building the resilience of the UK's supply chains, and that is the potential for domestic manufacturing. But before I turn on to it, could I please ask you, what are the structural reasons, at least in the United Kingdom, that limit or prohibit the building of domestic supply of items such as PPE?
In the first instance, as already mentioned, it is the cost of labour. Some of the process can be very labour intensive in some cases, and which is why China, in particular, has gained a competitive advantage because of its low-cost labour force and also the scale of its labour force as well. It goes deeper than that because the offshoring trend, as we've been talking about, goes back 2, 3, 4 decades now. And so actually, it's not just the labour and the manufacturing processes which have been offshored, but a lot of the know-how, the experience, the expertise in manufacturing has been lost. And it's usually said that it will, if you lose that ability, the capability to manufacture, and you lose the know-how, then it will take a generation to build that back up, starting from scratch.
You refer in your report to some areas in which the UK in the manufacturing sector has what might be described as a competitive advantage. There are areas in which the United Kingdom has high levels of manufacturing capability and capacity. Are there any ways that you suggest that that could be turned to domestic manufacture of items such as PPE and then of more complicated equipment such as ventilators and testing equipment?
I certainly think in terms of ventilators, because the UK has decided whether through policy or whether through economics to really focus on the high-value manufacturing, advanced manufacturing elements, so aerospace, biomedical technologies, for example. And they've left many of the sort of lower value-adding processes to other manufacturers in the rest of the world, predominantly in Asia. But if you're able to automate your manufacturing system, then you can remove the labour element which puts the UK at a disadvantage. And I think that is an area where certainly more focus should be placed and more focus from government policy should be placed in terms of developing that high-tech automation which can then allow UK manufacturers to compete effectively with other manufacturers in the rest of the world. And that's already going on in Germany. So it's not just an aspiration. It's something which our partners in Europe are already well aware of. And that is why I recommend that we also should be going down that path.
Could we please bring up that recommendation on screen? It's your recommendation at page 31 of your report. And you make the observation there that whilst it's not possible to reproduce the vast PPE and healthcare equipment manufacturing capacity presently based in Asia within the UK, the policy focus should be on developing a small, automated and scalable manufacturing capability. And this would be deployed to provide enough product to meet UK demand between depletion of emergency stockpiles that you've referred to at the beginning of the pandemic and the time when the global market was able to scale up to meet global demand. If I may, one suggestion which may be made is that investing in this kind of automation and equipment is expensive and that the appetite isn't there. What could the government do in terms of policy to encourage domestic manufacturing to build up resilience in the way that you suggest?
I think it very much needs to provide a long-term horizon for investment in automation, and specifically within the PPE sector. It can do that by committing to minimum volumes of spend with these companies which are investing in the technology. That's happened in Canada. It's in the glove manufacturing sector there, where the central procurement organisation has committed to certain volumes over time. It's also happened in Australia as well. So it's something which other governments and countries are looking at to provide that long-term long-term financial backing for a company, which gives them the confidence to actually go ahead and invest in this high capital automation equipment.
In addition to automation, you also refer in your report to potentially using circularity or reusable PPE. Could you help us with where that would fit into the picture of building supply chain resilience and how that might assist a country such as the UK with building resilience for a pandemic in the future?
Yes, certainly. The PPE industry is almost by definition a linear supply chain. So once it's been used, you throw it away. And in many times you're mandated to throw away a mask or a gown or gloves after you've used them. So it is part of the sort of what's called the sort of make, take, waste sector. But if you're able to bring an element of circularity into that, so actually once you've used a particular item, it can be safely reused, then it could have a really big impact on the volumes of new goods that you would need to reorder. Now, that will take advances in technology, and I think there have been some investment there. Certainly have been some research projects which will enable PPE to be more robust, but it will be able to allow them to be cleaned afterwards using new techniques, and then returned back to the hospital to be reused again.
Could I have up, please, your recommendation 5, which is on page 54 of your report? And here you make the suggestion that government should increase investment in research and development related to new and reusable forms of PPE. Do you mean that that investment should be only from the public sector, or is there scope for private sector investment in these areas? And if so, how could the government incentivise that? Yes,
I think this is really critical as we move forward over the next decade to the use and reuse of PPE. I think that the government should play a role in the research projects for helping to develop that new technology, but of course it would be the private sector who would be the driving force behind it. That would require there to be a commercial rationale for that investment. And again, that's really would need a commitment from these central procurement organisations to invest or to have minimum levels of spend on recyclable circular PPE. Finally, Professor Manners-Bell, a topic which you touched on at the beginning of your evidence, which is data visibility and how important it is for parties within supply chains to be able to see what is happening elsewhere within the chain. Could you help us, please, with what advancements have been made in terms of data visibility and the ability of manufacturers, customers at the end of the supply chain, and intermediaries to understand what's happening within a supply chain? There certainly have been huge advances in technologies in terms of providing real-time visibility platforms, which are very widespread throughout the industry of all sorts. It provides a visibility of usage right from in the PPE sector, from the ward level, all the way up through the supply chain, from local holdings of inventory through distribution centres, and there should be. It provides a control tower function, so someone sitting right over an overarching role to be able to make judgments based on real-time demand. Which was very much lacking throughout most of the early parts of the crisis. Could you explain in practical terms what that looks like? So we've heard in this module last week in evidence about modelling demand and about burn rates and an inability to predict the amount of PPE which was being used and to track the quantity of PPE which was being supplied. In what ways do what you suggest assist in that regard? It provides at any one point, should provide a supply chain manager with the tools to be able to, in terms of the level of procurement which is going to be needed to replenish stocks which are being used, and to do it from not just from a central perspective, but all the way from the end user, which in this case is the healthcare worker, through the supply chain. So having that level of information allows the manager to make more informed decisions, which then goes, if we relate that all the way back to the bullwhip effects slide that we saw earlier, by actually placing orders based on the reality rather than actually on models which may or may not be right, but in many cases are wrong, then it allows fulfillment in a much more ordered way and should not lead to the market dysfunction that we saw.
You've referred to real-time tracking. How is it possible, or could you please describe how it's possible to have real-time tracking in such granular detail of singular items of, for example, PPE? How does that work in practice? What role do you refer to such things as IoT, Internet of Things? What role does that have to play in procurement and supply chains in the future?
Well, at every stage within the supply chain, data is being provided to a supply chain management function, whether that is provided by the logistics company, who is maybe picking and packing from a warehouse. As soon as it's being taken out of that warehouse, that data will be released to say that we need to reorder to replenish that particular item for that warehouse. For the person who has ordered it, it will tell you that shipment of PPE will be delivered tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Once it has been delivered, then again an event will be triggered, data will be triggered to say it has been delivered, it is now here, and that will replenish the inventory. So it's a complete, it allows complete transparency of the supply chain and enabling managers to make better decisions.
And is this system or this kind of software, is that something which is available now, or is it something which is in development?
It's available now, and it's in most industries will be using this, even in sectors which are even more complicated, and there is more the potential for more obfuscation of the supply chain, such as the spare parts industry for the automotive industry, for example, which is very, very fragmented.
And if I may close, please, with your one of your recommendations, number 7, which is on 69 of your report. At the bottom of the page, please. You make a suggestion that the government also has a role in this respect by the development of new technologies, innovation and business investment, and not only with investment in technologies, but also skills training and research in supply chains.
Yes, indeed, and I think this is one of the facilitatory roles of government, to be able to foster this high-tech, advanced technology environment through things such it can impact upon, such as education and training as well, which would be very important for if we're developing a UK supply chain, to be able to have smaller players within the UK feed into that supply chain. They will need the people and resources to be able to integrate the technologies which are available presently. But that will allow much smaller organisations to become part of a more efficient and effective supply chain in the UK.
Professor Manasbell, I don't have any more questions.
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you very much indeed for your help, especially the written report that obviously we'll consider in more detail, but you've given an excellent summary this morning. I'm really grateful to you.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well, I shall return at 5 to 12.
All rise.
Sharma.
My lady, the next witness is Andrew Mitchell.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long, Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Mitchell, you have provided the inquiry with two witness statements, a corporate witness statement on behalf of the Department for International Trade, and then your personal witness statement responding to a number of questions posed by the inquiry. Would you be kind enough to confirm that those witness statements are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm.
We're grateful to the assistance you have provided to the inquiry to date. May I start, please, with something about your biography and background? You were a Director General in the Department for International Trade, were you not, between April 2020 and November 2023?
That's correct, yeah.
And prior to that, you served as Her Late Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Europe between July 2018 and May 2020.
That's correct.
And you are currently His Majesty's Ambassador to Germany, which you've served in since September of 2024.
That's correct.
In your role as the Director General in the Department for International Trade, you were responsible for leading three teams. The first, the JACT, the Joint Assistance Coordination Team. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And the second, the GSSEP, the Global Strategic and Sourcing Engagement Team.
That's also correct.
And also in relation to Project Defend.
That's right, yeah.
Could I start, please, with the Department for International Trade's role insofar as it affects preparedness for supply chain resilience? Was it intended in the department that it would play any role in an emergency response to a pandemic?
Certainly, to my knowledge, it was not foreseen that we would play such a role in a pandemic, no.
Was the department designated in any sense a lead government department for critical national infrastructure in terms of medical equipment or procurement of PPE or anything like that?
It was not, no.
And yet the Department for International Trade became, as it were, at the front line of procurement for PPE on behalf of the Department for Health and Social Care in markets around the world.
That's correct.
What sort of work was the department engaged in as the pandemic struck the United Kingdom?
So as the pandemic struck the United Kingdom, principally those teams in the Department for International Trade were responsible for sourcing investment from international markets and attracting that to the United Kingdom and supporting exporters as they looked for opportunities in international markets to sell their goods and services, but then also to negotiate trade agreements and, broadly speaking, to remove trade barriers and to work on trade in the international system.
In relation to supply chains, prior to the pandemic, was there any centrally coordinated supply chain resilience function, either within the department or within the government?
There was not.
What was the reason for that not having been taken up by departments such as DIT?
It's difficult for me to say. I think that at the time, the department, which as a consequence of having a very strong analytical function and global teams, did provide supply chain analysis and reports on issues in association with supply chains, didn't believe that it would be necessary to have a standing function to that end. In other words, the analytical function would be sufficient for most purposes.
Is it nonetheless true that the kind of expertise which was needed in the pandemic to analyse and consider and assist with supply chain resilience was to be found within your department?
I mean, I think as we went through the various stages of the crisis, and were principally 3 stages from the perspective of the work of that department, it became abundantly clear that, yes, this was a function that was indeed necessary and useful to government.
Turning, please, to the role on the front line, as it were, in respect of embassies, high commissions and consulates of the United Kingdom around the world. What role did they play in relation to the sourcing and procurement of items such as ventilators, PPE and testing equipment?
So in the very early stages of the crisis, it became apparent that supply chains were compromised in medical supplies, ventilators, PPE, etc. And the China team based out of our embassy in Beijing had identified that getting close to many of the manufacturers and the suppliers had given them an advantage in being able to procure some of these medical supplies. Indeed, at the time, I believe they were of the view that they had bought up all of the supplies that were available on the market in those very challenged circumstances. We had teams around the rest of the world. It seemed logical at that point, then recognising the China experience, to deploy that expertise also in respective markets elsewhere in the world, bearing in mind that we had DIT officials on the ground in many, many places around the world with essentially the same expertise.
As you've mentioned, there wasn't prior to the pandemic any standing capacity to do the kind of work which you've just described. The Joint Assistance Coordination Team was a group that was set up in response to the pandemic. Could you help us, please, with what that was, when it was set up, and what kind of work it did?
So, to your first question, what was it? It was a joint team created between the Department for International Trade and the Foreign Office to bring together officials essentially to source leads in overseas markets that might lead to new supplies of medical equipment. This was essentially a reaction to the circumstances that I described, challenged supply chains, and a call to action put out to overseas markets, to anyone who might have the opportunity to source supplies, essentially then to bring those to the attention of the British government. And therefore, we brought this team together, reflecting the fact that both the Foreign Office, as it was at the time, and the Department for International Trade had teams on the ground in many markets around the world who had experience of working with business, and indeed worked, in the case of the DIT teams, day to day alongside businesses in international markets.
You've referred, of course, to teams which were based in China, but there were also important teams in other areas of the world, including America, Singapore, Germany, Switzerland and Sweden, to name but a few. From your vantage point, what was your role with respect to those teams?
So the Joint Assistance Coordination Team was an effort to bring together a cell in London that was capable then of communicating with these teams in markets overseas on behalf of the Department for Health and Social Care. So the principle was that DHSC would provide what was called the demand signal, in other words, what was required by way of medical supplies. The joint team in London would then communicate that demand signal to our overseas posts, as we call them, and that those posts would then go and chase down opportunities, leads, wherever they might find them, then to send them back to that team created in London to make sense of what they were seeing, and then to send on those leads that the team felt were worthwhile back to DHSC.
My lady's inquiry has heard evidence last week of teams which were set up at pace and at speed. Was the JACT one of those teams set up in the very earliest stages of the pandemic?
It was indeed. It was set up on the 28th of March of 2020. in, I suppose, conditions of some uncertainty, partly because, of course, it wasn't clear how the pandemic would develop at that stage, but we recognise that supply chains for most medical supplies were indeed in significant stress, and therefore we brought teams together to create that demand management system, and principally, in fact, relied on the military cell that I had within my broader team for that purpose. And the reason for that was that, as far as we were concerned at the time, looking for leads in international markets was principally a logistical exercise, and we had access to teams who had extensive experience of operating in crisis conditions and essentially working around the clock and frankly moving leads backwards and forwards, which was how we understood the role in those first days.
Just to provide the inquiry with an idea of the scale of the task, you talked about working around the clock. Does that mean that you had people on shift so that they could pick up the phone and send emails to people based in embassies and consulates around the world?
We did indeed, yes. We established 3 rotas, so we were working 24/7, and principally, as you say, the reason for this was that we wanted to be immediately available in a market, that could be in Southeast Asia, to be able to respond to any inquiry that might come our way. And of course, the reason for this was that the market conditions were such that we did not want to lose any individual lead towards a medical supply.
How many people were there, broadly, roughly speaking, in the JACT?
In the JACT, initially, we brought together 20 from Foreign Office and 20 from DIT. But they were then looking after a team around the world, difficult to say, but I'd say there's a couple of thousand people who were working on this at the height of the crisis.
Just to get an idea of the organisational challenges, I wonder if perhaps we could bring up 493813. This is a process map created in April 2020 to set out how various teams were envisaged to be brought together. And on the left-hand side, it can be seen that there are sources of supplies coming from all DIT staff. And then at stage 2, it appears that there are 3 triage teams to deal with the leads that are coming in: the FCO JACT team, the DIT JAC team, and then there's another team beneath that, HLSB. Could you help us with what HLSB is, please?
HLSB is a team that was within the Department of International Trade, whose specialism was healthcare, life sciences, and the bioeconomy.
In the establishment of the system at the beginning of the pandemic, was there some confusion, some overlap between the work that each of those 3 teams were doing?
I would say it was a very difficult initial couple of weeks for the team, in the sense that what you had, the HLSB team epitomises this, a group of experts, frankly, in healthcare, life sciences work, particularly their responsibility, investment and export support, as I had described, recognising that this wasn't going to be fit for purpose for the scale of the task that confronted us. So building a set of teams with people across Whitehall, and worth bearing in mind, of course, that we were remote from each other, operating on Microsoft Teams platform. Many of us had never met. So in those initial stages, we're both bringing teams together from different parts of the government system, but also in conditions in which we simply couldn't bring everybody together into one place and work through a plan. So yes, it was difficult in those initial stages. The complexity was high. I would say that the willingness of everybody to lean into this task, recognising the scale of the national emergency that we were facing, was nonetheless really, really significant.
One of the features that my lady's inquiry has heard in respect of the Department of Health and Social Care is the preponderance of the use of emails and forms and Excel spreadsheets. No less, it seems, at least to be referred to on this chart, with references to forms, and spreadsheets and emails on the right-hand side. Did the systems which the JACT and the Department for International Trade were using, did they cause problems for you in terms of coordination and efficiency?
I wouldn't say that the forms themselves caused issues. I think the issue that we struggled with was developing a sensible single process. It was, in a sense, the logic behind the creation of the forms that was the issue for us. And I talk elsewhere in my own witness statement about the importance of commercial expertise, so commercial policy expertise in the design of these systems. I think one of the issues that we had in the early stages was without direct access to that commercial policy support, some of the system design questions, they were not optimal, frankly, and you know, we learned the lessons from that through this process, and as you've seen from the end of stage 2 of the crisis, from the DIT perspective, we felt that we had got to a reasonable place, but it is the commercial design question there that's the issue, I think.
Could we have up, please, on the screen 489577? And if we could scroll down to the email at the bottom, slide 1, talking about overlap and inefficiency within the systems established by the Department for International Trade. The question here is asked as to why there are 2 JACTs involved in the triage process, and considering that it would only need to be 1 team. Is this a reference to the speed at which the system was established and the risk of overlap and duplication of effort?
In fact, it's a reference to the fact that at the beginning of the crisis, we thought that the rational response was to keep the teams, as it were, in separate boxes under a single leadership. That would provide for speed. That was certainly the consideration at the time. We quickly realised that this wasn't, in fact, the right way to do this. So within a couple of weeks, we'd redesigned the team such that we fused the FCDO and the DIT and the HLSB teams into one. So at the beginning of this stage of the crisis, essentially we were operating with 3 teams under a single joint leadership for those reasons.
Could we zoom out from this email chain and go up to the top? There's a reference there to about the JACT teams being right. And of course, you're not on this email chain, Mr. Mitchell. I'd just like to understand it from your vantage point, from looking at the JACT overall. One of the issues, it seems, is that there's a negotiation with the FCO, and there's reference there to politics being an issue. Is that something that you recognised from your work in the Department for International Trade, that there was some tension or some politics at play between the department and the FCO?
This wasn't my experience. My experience was rather that as teams working together on the crisis, what we were doing in those initial stages was really trying to work out what the most rational way to operate together was. I had close working relationships with my FCO counterparts, had known both of them for a very long time, and certainly didn't feel that this was an impediment. I can entirely understand, however, that somebody within the system might infer that that was indeed the reason, but it certainly wasn't my experience.
Thank you. Could we take that down, please?
Can I just check, do we think politics in that context meant departmental politics as opposed to party politics?
Yes, my lady. I think my interpretation of this is that this is the politics of the office rather than the politics of Parliament.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. One of the references that you make in your witness statement about the complexity of working between the Department of International Trade and the FCO is that structures were difficult for staff based in overseas offices to navigate. Could you talk us through that, please? What issues did that create, having staff working in embassies, coordinating with the FCO and the Department for International Trade in the UK, and then them coordinating again with the Department for Health and Social Care as the lead government department? What complexities did that create?
Yeah, so the initial design map that you showed the inquiry demonstrates the problem with that initial design, namely that if you were in a post overseas and you'd had access to a lead, you'd be looking at that design map and saying, which of those entities do I send my lead into? And this is the reason essentially why quite quickly into the process we recognised that we needed entirely to fuse these organisations and to create a design of the system that essentially had operations on one side and strategy and briefing on the other side, such that later in the crisis, if you had a lead, you'd have essentially one contact point.
Did you have any problems? I've encountered it from my work that's been government related, with having different meeting platforms allowed in different government departments. So I found there are different policies, like one department will only meet on Teams and another department will only meet on Google Meet or Zoom or whatever. Did you have that as a problem at all?
Not in this particular work, because we were all on the Microsoft Teams platform globally, so that meant the Foreign Office and DIT and all of our teams globally. So in that regard, no. But certainly across Whitehall, in the initial stages of the crisis, there wasn't a single platform for communications. And yes, we had to get accounts on different providers in order to be able to participate in meetings.
Thank you, my lady. In terms of the guidance which was being provided by the Department for Health and Social Care, could we please have a look at 489583? This is guidance being provided by the Department of Health and Social Care to those on the ground or through JACT about the procurement of ventilators. And if we could zoom in, please, to reject anything. That's it, thank you. In respect of IPPV ventilators, this guidance suggests that anything should be rejected other than IPPV ventilators. And then the second and third lines of guidance refer to looking at documentation and that the watchwords are IPPV. But then if the documentation isn't clear, that one should look at the photograph of the item being procured and then a rudimentary description, if I can put it that way, of a large technical machine being of the ventilator that's being looked for. Could you help us, please, with your experience and the experience of those in country with the guidance that was being sent by the Department of Health and Social Care in respect of the procurement of complicated equipment such as ventilators and also testing equipment, but also PPE?
Yes, I mean, clearly, in order for those teams in markets overseas who had no particular experience of medical supplies and medical supply chains to be able to do the job that we were asking, we clearly needed quite detailed specifications for the medical equipment required. And it's well documented, including in my own evidence, that in the initial stages, that level of technical specification was, from the perspective of those posts overseas, not to the degree that we required. And this was a known issue, one that we worked on together. We rectified that. The Department for Health and Social Care acted on that requirement relatively quickly, but it's certainly true to say that at the early stages, this was a factor, yes.
Coordination with the Department of Health and Social Care was an ongoing issue with the JACT. Could we please bring up 493811? This is an email on the 2nd of April, which you are CC'd into from the head of the JACT from the FCO to Emily Lawson at the Department of Health and Social Care. If we could zoom in, please, to once concern flagged to me by the team in the middle of the page. One of the concerns flagged by the team has been the difficulty of ensuring a fast turnaround from DHSC of the proposals coming from posts and being coordinated by the JACT, and therefore risking losing opportunities. I understand that today we lost an order for 20 ventilators from Israel because we weren't nimble enough. And there are concerns in the China network that similar delays might cost us larger numbers there, where international demand is enormous. Again, drawing on your vantage point, Mr. Mitchell, was that a problem that was persistent, at least in the early stages of the pandemic, of offers and potential offers of supply being routed to the DHSC, but then there being delays in them being processed?
This was a feature particularly of the very early stages, I would say, of the crisis. And of course, from the perspectives, and you can entirely understand this, of the teams out in the market, timing was critical because leads were available very often only for a short period of time. That was the way that the market was operating at that point. And the turnaround times were challenging, and this is partly down to the fact that we entirely recognise this, that the Department for Health and Social Care was dealing with a huge profusion of expressions of interest. I would say the fault was also partly ours at this stage of the process. Frankly, we weren't giving DHSC quite the level of specification around the leads that we were providing that would have allowed them to take quicker decisions. So this is an accurate picture, I think, of a moment in time. But I would say that there were issues on both sides that we ultimately recognised and then dealt with as we created the GSEP, brought in commercial expertise, and then redesigned those commercial processes.
And just in terms of the work that JACT was doing and those on the ground with the embassies were doing, were they conducting any sort of triage process about the offers that were being sent in to the Department for Health and Social Care, or were they simply forwarding on offers and leads that they thought ought to be followed up?
I mean, the principal focus here was on maximising the numbers of leads that we were able to secure. So certainly the message from the centre was within the constraints set out in the document that you showed earlier. In other words, there was a specification, nonetheless, to identify as many leads as possible. There was some verification, but this was principally around the good standing of the companies. What did we know about the businesses that were offering these leads? So the level of triage, to use that word, that was being applied was relatively low at this stage in the crisis.
And were you informed by officials or others at the Department of Health and Social Care that at least at their end they were buckling under the pressure of the numbers of offers? Was there any suggestion that further triage could be done either by the JACT in London or by the teams which were based in country?
The point at which we brought in commercial expertise and the commercial policy team within the Department for International Trade then connected with the DHSC commercial team and with the Cabinet Office commercial team, that was very much the discussion. So what level of specification could we then provide that would support a faster procurement process overall?
And you've touched upon the next subject I'd like to come to you with, which is the commercial expertise which was available in country on the ground of those receiving the offers. The JACT, of course, reformed and became part of something called the GSSEP. But whilst it was the JACT, at the very earliest stages of the pandemic, was there available to it the sort of commercial and subject matter expertise on the ground in country where they were operating?
on the ground in the country in which the teams were operating, there was commercial expertise available, either within the post, the missions concerned, or through regional functions. So the Foreign Office had and has regional commercial functions to support the work of posts overseas. We didn't have, in the early stages, we didn't have that within the JACT. As I said earlier on, that a little bit because the intent really was to mobilise as quickly as possible to proliferate the numbers of leads that we had access to. And it felt in the early stages a little bit as though this was a logistical operation rather than a commercial operation. We quickly recognised that wasn't right.
But forgive me, it's right, isn't it, that the Department for International Trade, it did have some commercial expertise, and I think you've set out in your witness statement that it's your view that that commercial expertise should have been deployed much earlier.
That is my view, yes.
And if that commercial expertise had been deployed at an earlier stage in the pandemic, what effect would that have had on the triaging process which was happening in country, and then on the backup of offers that was occurring in the Department of Health and Social Care?
I mean, as I referred to a little bit earlier on, there would have been a much better commercial process end to end, which would have been, frankly, to the benefit of DHSC in allowing them then to manage the backlog more effectively. And we should have spotted that at an earlier stage. We saw the effects of this essentially then in the GSEP process, GSSEP process, because then having rectified that, brought in the commercial expertise that we required, redesigned then the procurement process. We had a better process, so we could see the evidence of that later on in the crisis.
The inquiry's heard from a number of witnesses that in that first 100 days that speed was of the essence. And so I wonder if we could please have a look at an email on the 20th of April 2020, so about 30 days or so into that 100 days. It's 493856. And if we can zoom in, please, to the top bullet point. The issue with supply chains was not only being noticed by those officials sending emails within the JACT. In this bullet point, which is, as I say, on the 20th of April, it refers to the Cabinet Secretary in number 10 getting concerned about the lack of overall grip on supply chains work, both domestic and international, across all areas, including medical and food. It did not sound as though it was aimed at us, but more big picture. And then there's reference there to there being too many competing and duplicating structures in place. Does that email, again, does that reflect your understanding of the position as it developed in as late as 20th of April 2020?
Yes, I think this is fair. There was, certainly from the narrower perspective of the work that I was involved in, particularly at this point, we were encountering difficulties in being able to properly track leads through the system. There was a lot of duplication in terms of working with distributors and suppliers. So I think that that suggestion of complexity, it certainly rings true for me. Yeah.
Turning, please, away from the JACT and towards what became I think you referred to it as GSEP.
GSEP, yeah.
GSEP. What was it that converted the JACT into GSEP? When did that happen? And what problems did GSEP fix?
So we also, through this process, of course, were running lessons learned exercises, and those lessons learned exercises were demonstrating a number of the problems that we've talked about today. So what we attempted to do in GSEP was to clarify the role of the department, which was essentially in three areas for the purposes of the work of GSEP. First of all, sourcing leads overseas, as we'd done with the JACT, but secondly then working with individual countries and with groups of countries in international markets, and thirdly then looking to how we could diversify sources of supply, so working with new suppliers. And GSEP, which came into existence at the end of April, was a response to the difficulties and the recognition of the difficulties we'd faced in the first stage of the crisis, and then a better understanding of where DIT particularly could add value, which was in those three areas, plus, of course, the work that separately and at the same time started on Project Defend, which was about supply chain diversification.
You refer to Project Defend. What was Project Defend, and what issues was it investigating? What did it find about the supply chains, in particular in healthcare equipment?
So Project Defend was a supply chain resilience exercise that was begun with a view to taking a slightly longer term look at where supply chain vulnerabilities might manifest. So if we understand the work that we were doing through the JACT and GSEP essentially as the short-term response, this was the longer-term response that recognised that we had encountered supply chain problems that had not been anticipated in the way that they'd manifest, and then thought about what kinds of mitigation we would require, but starting very much with the data. So the work that was initially done by the consultants BCG in support of the department identified where potentially vulnerable supply chains, which supply chains might they be.
So could I just pause for a moment? So it was noticed that there was a fundamental problem with supply chains that the Department for International Trade was considering. It brought in Boston Consulting Group, an external consultancy, to assist it with the analysis of supply chains. And the direction for that to happen came, did it not, from the very top, that on the 25th of April of 2020, it was the Prime Minister that commissioned a piece of work to interrogate where the vulnerabilities lie in our critical goods and supply chains, to consider where they are, to consider how they could be mitigated, and with a particular view to potentially building domestic manufacturing capacity. Is that right?
Yes, so the Commission did indeed come from the top, and Project Defend was the response, and Project Defend then looked at the kinds of interventions that you might want to make in a market in order to increase resilience, of which one was potentially domestic manufacturing.
And the department in which that was located was the Department for International Trade, was it not?
It was.
How long did Project Defend last for, and what were fundamentally its outcomes in terms of the changes that were made to the structures within government looking at supply chains and supply chain resilience?
So Project Defend ran from April of 2020 until August, I believe, of 2021. It went through 4 stages of evolution. Initially, looking at a number of critical supply chains on a very fast trajectory to work out where the potential vulnerabilities existed in those critical national supply chains might be, and then the kinds of actions that might be taken to mitigate some of the risks that applied.
Now, I pause you there. Just to be clear, Project Defend wasn't only about healthcare supply chains. It was a piece of work that looked at supply chains across the piece, but healthcare supply chains, the ones that we're considering, was certainly part of its work.
In those initial phases, yes, that's correct.
What Project Defend arrived at was a central coordination point, a new institution within government that was initially called the Global Supply Chains Directorate. Could you help us, please, with what that was and what it became?
I think it's important to say that DIT had responsibility overall for the intelligence and for the analysis, for triaging the systems across government, but individual departments were responsible throughout, from the beginning and throughout the process, and that remains the case today for the management of the supply chains that fall within their departmental competence. And so the directorate that was created came from essentially an assessment that Defend had done good work. It had identified a gap in the way that government operated. In other words, an ability to assess continuously and to use data to do this, supply chain vulnerability, to build expertise, and then to support those government departments in their work, their own individual supply chains. And this is essentially what the Global Supply Chains Directorate was designed to do.
And of the other recommendations, or what came out of Project Defend, in addition to the Global Supply Chains Directorate, were an in-house team of analysts to consider supply chain vulnerabilities, but also attempts to reduce vulnerabilities in supply chains by diversifying or attempting to diversify suppliers and supplier location, and that there would be increased global cooperation with other strategic partners around the world. Is that right?
That is correct. And I mean, essentially, the interventions that could be applied to supply chains included diversification of supply, potential domestic manufacture, potential stockpiling, or international coordination. And those lenses, as we described them, were applied differentially to each supply chain, depending on the nature of the supply chain involved. This did indeed, overall, I think, increase, first of all, very considerably our understanding of the nature and the functioning of those supply chains. But it gave us the capacity then to remove risk from supply chains, working with those government departments in order to be able then to identify where the pressures were and to use the interventions that I've described.
One of the endpoint pieces of work of Project Defend and the directorate that was set up, which incidentally was renamed the Economic Security and Supply Chain Resilience Directorate, was something called the Critical Import and Supply Chain Strategy. Could we please bring it up? It's 494249. This is a document published by the UK government in January of 2024. Could we turn, please, to page 27? And in the spotlight box in the middle of the page, about halfway down, it says measures such as stockpiles and targeted buffer stocks are specifically designed to mitigate a specific product shortage. And this is a spotlight on what the government is doing with supplier coordination on health supply chains. This is one measure, and then it continues down in the paragraphs below to refer in particular to the NHS implementing multiple supplier framework agreements to improve security of supply and to manage demand spikes or individual supplier challenges. Mr. Mitchell, Professor Manners-Bell, who's just given evidence, has considered this document, and this is what he says about it. And I wonder if after I've read it out to you, whether you provide me with your answer. This is his report at paragraph 259. He says this, that the UK government's prioritisation of making PPE and healthcare equipment supply chains more resilient remains unclear, looking at this document. In its report, Critical Imports and Supply Chain Strategy, published in 2024, the sector revealed only a cursory mention and specific reference to China was absent, saying only, and the passages I've just read out to you, the NHS will implement multiple supplier framework agreements to improve security of supply and so on. He refers to the Scottish and Welsh governments who both aspire to self-sufficiency in some types of PPE, but there is no evidence of a strategy formulation process setting out how specific supply chain resilience will be achieved. And so from the beginning of Project Defend, at which the emphasis was on diversification of supply, partnering with allies, strategic reserves of critical goods and expanding UK production, Professor Manners-Bell has considered this and says it just doesn't go far enough. Could I have, please, your reflections on that?
In fact, it's difficult for me to comment in any detail on this since the report was published a year and 11 months after I ceased any involvement in this work. In a way, I mean, I would say that this is broadly what I would anticipate and expect to see in a strategy that looked at supply chain resilience across the spectrum. In other words, this is a strategy for supply chain resilience for the national economy rather than a sector-specific supply chain strategy. That would be for the DHSC. But I do, I mean, two things. First of all, recognise within this spotlight here the actions, the interventions that Defend recommend. So you can see in the text here what's happening around domestic production, for example, and diversification of supply. Elsewhere in the report, I think it is also worth saying that China is recognised as a very significant market, and the market with the highest risk associated with it in the way that this report assesses risk. So it's difficult for me to say more than that, to be honest, but as I say, I think this is broadly to be expected from a national supply chain strategy.
Would you expect such matters as diversification of supply, support for domestic manufacturing, and investment in supply chain technology, insofar as it affects healthcare supply chains, to be matters which are taken up by the Department for Health and Social Care rather than in this UK government document?
I mean, it was always the case through Defend and the work then of the Global Supply Chains Directorate that the relationship was as between, for DIT, a central intelligence function supporting departments, and the responsibility for the supply chains themselves, which sat within the departments. So, yes.
Mr. Mitchell, thank you very much. I don't have any further questions. My lady, there are some Rule 10s.
There are indeed. Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Weatherby sitting there.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mitchell, I am going to ask you just a few questions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, and two short topics about intermediaries. So you describe in your statement, and for the record, we don't need to look at it, but for the record, it's 13.17, that the intermediary market in the context of ventilators was, quote, much riskier than procuring directly from manufacturers. And you state, again for the record, paragraph 4.10, that in respect of guidance on ventilator opportunities issued by the DHSC on the 5th of April 2020, and I quote, the guidance instructed officials conducting triage to be cautious of new suppliers entering the market and claiming to have stock. This was due to an increase in middlemen offering stock on behalf of companies. So my question, can you help us very briefly, just what was the risk that you were referring to there in your statement, the risk from the intermediary market?
And this was principally the experience of the team in China on the ground.
I'm going to come to that.
That, you know, they spent a bit of time essentially looking at what was available on the market and had discovered that sources of supply were much, much more reliable when they went direct to the manufacturers.
Yes.
That the intermediaries were essentially sourcing, because of the way that the market was working, because there was very high demand and very low supply, lots of new suppliers were stepping into the market. And the experience was that the product supplied via intermediaries was likely to be harder, frankly, to verify from the perspective of
so issues of quality,
yes,
fraud, non-delivery, those sorts of things.
The issue was essentially that because new suppliers were coming onto the market, they were essentially untested.
Yes. It was similar guidance which I just read out, to be cautious due to middlemen. Was that also issued in respect of PPE? Or don't you know? You don't know.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay. I mean, you state again, paragraph 1321 of your statement, that and I quote again, the China team's preferred primary sourcing strategy for PPE in China was to work with large state-owned healthcare distributors known as state-owned enterprises, SOEs. And that allowed for larger order sourced from multiple factories, and you described 1322, that the China team's experience that, and I quote, most offers of PPE supply from small intermediaries were high risk. And so I'm sure you'd agree that the China team would be well placed to express that view, and that's the view that you would share.
Yes, I mean, they were looking, I mean, that word high risk, or the term high risk, I think probably has to be seen in the right context there, which is, I interpret that risk to be both quality but also questions of reliability of supply.
Yes.
So they're talking about going to the SOEs because the SOEs are in a position to source supply when individual factories also stop supplying. So they had access to a broader set of sources. So from the perspective of managing risk, they're managing risk of supply but also risk on quality.
Yeah. Now we've heard that the PPE buy-sell, DHSC and the UK government generally, had a very large number of offers, and both the buy-sell and the VIP lane that we've heard about had a lot of those offers from small intermediaries, which were necessarily more high risk, as we've discussed. Was anything done to communicate from your department about these high risk problems?
So we, the point at which we, as GSEP, so the Global Strategic Sourcing and Engagement Project, started work setting out very clear demand signals on behalf of DHSC. Then we issued a set of documents as part of that new commercial process, which included a statement of good standing, an opportunity risk assessment that allowed us then to work with the teams on the ground to conduct the due diligence. It wasn't formal due diligence in the commercial sense, but nonetheless gathering the data that allowed us then to make those assessments together with DHSC.
But was the clear message going back to DHSC that the problem of high risk small intermediaries was something that needed to be considered carefully?
I mean, I can only answer that in relation to the process that we put together, which was essentially that if a supplier failed to fill out a statement of good standing, for example, automatically that lead would not be taken forward. Okay.
Second point, and quickly, could we have up INQ 000 493 919? And just while that's going up, this is an email that you produce, paragraph 4.48 of your statement, and it's the end email of a thread from JACT leaders. It's specifically from Frank Clifford, Head of Operations, to Fred Perry. And it's headed PPE system broken, and it refers to approaching a Rubicon moment. Perhaps we've even crossed it already. The PP team is adding no value, but at the same time are under increasing pressure. They've been asked to stop forwarding items to DHSC escalation. And then the second bullet point is the one I want to ask you about. Additionally, the frustration is growing at Post. And then the second sentence, we even have the ludicrous situation of a manufacturer being identified some time ago, sending information into the .gov system, and now being asked to undertake due diligence on a middleman who's offering items from that company. So is what's being said there that instead of DHSC purchasing directly from the manufacturer that had been identified by your team, that the DHSC was now indicating back to your team that it was considering purchasing the same products but from an intermediary who would sell it at a marked up price and at greater risk?
I mean, it's difficult for me to say specifically with relation to this example, but certainly we were aware at the time that intermediaries were operating in the market and offering their supply to multiple sources, but there were multiple intermediaries also leading back to the same sources of supply. So this was absolutely a feature of the market at the time.
The question really was this a problem between your department and the DHSC in terms that you'd identified this lead, yet they'd come back through asking you to do due diligence on a middleman? Was that part of the problem that's being
It's difficult. As I say, it's difficult to say with this particular example, but I mean the more general problem, which the GSEP process tried to resolve, was that the commercial process that we were following was not in those initial stages sufficiently clear. So that was the aim.
I won't take any further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Thomas, he's over there.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell. I represent FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Mr. Mitchell, during a critical phase of the pandemic response, there were significant concerns, were there not, about inclusivity of procurement practices, particularly ensuring that PPE and other healthcare products procured met the diverse needs of all healthcare workers, including those from ethnic minority groups and individuals with specific disabilities. Now, let me come to my question. I've got two questions for you. The DHSC programme delivery board met on the 12th of June 2020, and that highlighted a strategic risk concerning the lack of inclusive product specifications. And if we can just call up one document, INQ 000339236 underscore 0029, thank you. Can you see that on your screen?
I can, thank you.
Can you go down to point 4? Do you see that? It's highlighted risks that we do not provide the inclusive product specification for all end users' requirements, e.g. Ethnic minorities, those with having disability. Yeah. And if we go on to page 31, so that's 2 pages after, 2 slides down, so it's, yeah. Yeah, and we can see that you are there. Can you highlight? It's the fifth one down, Andrew Mitchell. Yeah, there you go. Now, so you were at this meeting. You were aware that this risk had having been identified at that time. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, I was at that meeting, and I recognise that risk. Yeah.
Yeah. So that brings me on to my second question, which is this. So, Mr. Mitchell, what specific discussions or actions were taken to address this identified risk to ensure that procurement processes were aligned with the diverse needs of end users? Help us.
So, I mean, I would simply say about this, first of all, that, I mean, I entirely recognise that this is a very significant issue, and to your point, I was at that meeting and heard that risk discussed. I'm afraid that my responsibilities were principally in the international supply space rather than anything to do with the product specifications. So once those specifications were made, they were passed to my department, and we were then sourcing those leads on behalf of the DHSC.
But forgive me, Mr. Mitchell, that wasn't my question. I understand your answer. But my question was, you being at the meeting, even though you say you didn't have the responsibility, I get that. My question was, this risk having been identified, particularly with ethnic minorities, my question was, what discussions or actions were taken to address this at the meeting? Not necessarily by you.
I'm afraid I don't recall what actions were taken at that meeting on that topic. I'm sorry.
Could it be that it wasn't discussed? It was just let through?
I'm sorry, I don't recall what actions were taken on that topic at this.
It's an important point, isn't it?
It's an important point, yeah.
Thank you, milady.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you for your help in preparing statements and the like. And thank you for coming here today. I hope we didn't bring you over from Germany.
Always a pleasure, milady.
Well, I hope you can combine it with some other meeting in Whitehall or whatever. But thank you very much for your help.
Thanks very much indeed.
Very well. Should we break now? And I shall return at 1:55.
All rise.